Cascading delays had already reached every dock door on the Memphis floor 60-some hours into the notice window, and mine was apparently still the only phone number the bank's relationship manager had on file. My name is Harold Hendricks. I'm 56. For 22 years, I built and ran Highland Haulage's entire multi-terminal freight network, the kind of operational continuity a bank doesn't finance blind. $318,000, the balance left on my son's medical school loans, co-signed a decade ago when nobody else would, sat in a payment schedule only I actually tracked. I hadn't mentioned that number in this building, not once, not to anyone. Eduardo had called it redundant 7 weeks earlier, folding my role into a structure a board resolution could approve in one afternoon, 21 calendar days before anyone from Highland Haulage's own banking partners ever thought to ask a follow-up question. He hadn't checked the credit agreement first. Nobody on his side had. Harold, I need you to walk me through exactly what this means. I let a beat pass before responding. Out past the loading bays, a diesel engine turned over twice before catching, the smell of it drifting through the dispatch office's cracked window, entirely unconnected to whatever was actually unfolding this morning. How bad is it? Eduardo asked. That depends whether your banking partners already sent the letter or just the phone call. They sent both. I already had a fairly good guess what his answer would be, the kind of guess 22 years earns you. Did legal review the credit agreement's key person language before any of this went to the board? He went quiet long enough that the quiet itself became the answer. The brass key sat on the desk beside my coffee, the one I'd carried on my ring for over 2 decades, worn smooth from years against the original dispatch office safe. Its edges softened the particular way only genuine daily use ever softens metal. Nobody had asked me to open that safe in a long while. Not since most of its contents migrated to a cloud system the terminal had never quite finished digitizing everything into. I could still find the right drawer with my eyes closed. There's a standard 21 calendar days built into most renewal cycles in this industry, I said. This isn't that. How long do we actually have? 66 hours, best I can tell, before the bank moves from notice to formal action. He didn't ask how I'd arrived at that particular figure without consulting anything. Nobody asked me to prepare for this morning, and I'd rather that be understood clearly up front, because what comes next could easily read, to someone who's never spent 22 years signing for equipment nobody else wanted responsibility for, like a plan executed by design. It wasn't a plan. It was simply a man who'd never once stopped being the name printed on the bank's own paperwork, whether the current building remembered that or not. Eduardo worked through 3 more questions. I kept each answer to a single sentence, then told him I'd be back in touch within the hour. 66 hours to sort it out, and the board had already burned 9 of them arguing about who got to draft the press release before anyone had actually sat down and read the exact covenant language it would eventually need to explain to a room full of people who hadn't asked for any of this either. An ice storm shut down I-40 westbound without warning 2 weeks before Eduardo ever said the word redundant out loud, stranding 11 loaded trailers on the wrong side of the closure with a rest area radio channel that wouldn't stop crackling. Dispatch, watching it unfold from the Memphis terminal floor, leaned toward parking everything and riding it out. That instinct made sense on paper and would have been wrong in practice. 22 winters on this floor teaches you to listen for a particular pattern in how the state DOT repeats itself on the closure line. When the same mile marker gets read out twice in one bulletin, the shutdown isn't measured in hours anymore, and refrigerated freight doesn't care whose call it was to wait. Send them around on the state route, not the marked detour, I told the shift lead. Everyone else is about to pick the detour, and it'll jam worse than the interstate ever did. That's 90 extra minutes a truck. It's 90 minutes against losing 11 full loads outright. He ran with it. I stayed on the channel myself for most of the night, talking each driver through the turns one at a time and calling out mile markers so the board could track them live. Unglamorous work, a headset, and a paper map spread across the desk because the routing software still hadn't caught up to the closure. Every trailer made it through clean by sunrise. The only real cost was extra fuel and a longer shift for 11 drivers. Nothing that touched a client's penalty clause or showed up anywhere above the terminal floor. I still wrote it up in full that same morning, dated and filed the way everything in my record gets filed, cross-checked against the terminal's own weather closure history going back further than most of the current staff had worked here. A habit that has less to do with credit than with the fact that an unrecorded save just becomes the next disaster somebody has to rediscover from scratch on a night nobody's prepared for. Min found the entry later that week doing something unrelated and mentioned it in passing, more curious than impressed. 11 trailers, nothing lost. You wrote all of that up yourself. Same as always. Under the terminal's name, or under Harold Hendricks specifically, there's really only ever been one way I file things. He studied me for a second. The way people do right before deciding a comment isn't worth making. You've got a strange amount of paperwork for a good night, Harold. Bad nights are where the paperwork actually earns its keep, I said. Good ones just confirm the system works. He didn't push it further, and we moved on to the rest of the week's freight numbers. The kind of quiet exchange that happened between the two of us fairly often, and that nobody upstairs would ever catch wind of unless something eventually went wrong enough to send them digging for it. Driving home that night along the river road, heater running, the safe key still riding in my coat pocket from habit rather than need, I thought about how little of what actually keeps a terminal running ever makes it into a quarterly report, let alone into whatever slide someone eventually builds to explain the company to a room full of people who've never once stood on the dock at 3 in the morning. Sooner or later, somebody always finds out the hard way exactly which parts of it were load-bearing. Eduardo's office ran the air conditioning cold enough that I could feel it through my jacket the moment I walked in. A floor-to-ceiling window facing the yard behind him, and directly across from his desk, angled so any visitor would see it first, a framed business magazine cover of himself under the headline 50 Under 50. It was a full week before the firing itself, though I didn't know that yet. Harold. Good. Come in, he said, not looking up from his laptop right away. I've been going through the org chart. Some of these reporting lines predate email. Some of those lines exist because they still work, I said. Legacy overhead doesn't scale, though. That's the honest read. He finally looked up, tapped the glass over his own photo twice, the way I'd already watched him do in 2 prior meetings, always right before he wanted a conversation to wrap. I need this operation running lean enough to actually justify the growth story I'm telling the board. What does lean look like for terminal operations specifically? Consolidation. Fewer layers between me and the floor. I am the layer between you and the floor, I said. 22 years of it. And I respect that history. Genuinely. He said it the way a man says something he's rehearsed rather than felt. But history isn't a growth strategy. I need people who can operate at the speed this company's about to move at. Has anyone from finance walked you through what actually keeps this terminal bonded to its lenders? I've read the covenant summary. Standard boilerplate. It's not boilerplate. It names specific people by role, and it's not a section anyone can just skim past and assume it means nothing. Everything in a credit agreement names roles. That's how banks write contracts. Not always this specifically. I'm not planning to touch financing structure, he said. I'm planning to touch reporting structure. Those are different conversations. They're the same conversation more often than people assume. I'll take that under advisement. He glanced at his phone once, then back at me. For what it's worth, I don't think you're wrong about your value here. I think you're wrong about how replaceable that value is. That's a genuinely testable claim. It is, and I intend to test it. Duly noted, he said, in the tone of a man closing a tab rather than considering a point. I didn't press further, and I've turned that choice over more than once since. Whether spelling it out plainly, right there in his office, would have actually changed anything, or whether a man that's certain of his own read only ever hears confirmation, regardless of what's actually said to him. I've never settled on an answer I trust completely. I only know I chose silence over repetition that day, and would likely choose it again, since repeating an argument to someone already decided rarely does more than hand them a transcript of your concern. This channel's still young enough that most of its audience found it early, and if that's you, it means more than a comment ever could. News stories go up here often, and I'd rather earn your time than ask for it outright. Whatever Eduardo genuinely believed he was streamlining that particular afternoon was, in fact, about to turn out to be the one structure in the entire building he could least afford to actually touch. HR had already printed the separation paperwork before Eduardo called me into his office that Tuesday. The pages sitting in a folder he hadn't bothered closing all the way, his office still carrying the same cold, air-conditioned edge it always had. Harold, I want to be straightforward with you, he said. We're consolidating terminal operations under a regional structure. Your role's being eliminated, effective today. Eliminated or reassigned? Eliminated. I looked at the numbers myself. This saves us roughly $144,000 a year once we fold the position into the regional manager's scope. That's a small number against 22 years of institutional dependency. Legacy overhead doesn't scale, Harold. I said that to you last week, and I meant it. He tapped the glass of his framed magazine cover once, almost absent-mindedly this time, the gesture already worn into muscle memory. This isn't a reflection of your work. It's a structural decision. I'd like that characterization in writing. Structural decision, specifically, not performance-related. I can have HR note that. I'd appreciate it noted before I sign anything. Fair enough. He slid a pen across the desk. I didn't pick it up right away. Has legal reviewed this against the credit agreement's personnel provisions? This is an HR matter, not a legal one. I don't see why the two would even intersect. They intersect because of exactly what my role is named for in that agreement. I'm not aware of anything specific naming your role individually. Then I'd suggest someone become aware of it before this goes any further. It touches both. I'd ask that someone confirm that before this becomes effective. I appreciate the diligence. Genuinely. But the decision's already been approved by the board's compensation committee. Approved isn't the same as reviewed for every implication. Those are the same thing in most rooms, Harold. Not in every room, I said, and left it there. He didn't have anything ready for that. I set the pen down on the folder without signing, unhurried. The way you set something down when you've already decided its weight doesn't require haste. Outside his office, through the glass, I could see the afternoon shifts starting to gather near the dispatch board, none of them yet aware anything in the building had changed. I'll want a copy of today's paperwork, and I'll want the effective date confirmed in writing with a timestamp. Why the timestamp specifically? Because certain things I'm obligated to notify depend on exactly when my status changed, not just that it did. That sounds unnecessarily formal for an internal transition. It's not internal. Some of what my role touches isn't ours alone to change. He didn't ask what I meant by that, and I didn't offer it unprompted. The HR confirmation arrived by email at 4:15 that afternoon, effective immediately. It never once referenced the credit facility. It never once referenced my name in connection with anything the bank had actually put its own signature on. That alone would have settled into an ordinary bad Tuesday, and stayed there, one more folder in a drawer somewhere. One more line in a spreadsheet nobody outside HR would ever open again. But Highland College's next quarterly compliance certificate to its senior lender was already scheduled for 5 weeks out. A routine filing nobody in that building currently had any real reason to think twice about. Sitting on a calendar nobody outside finance had ever bothered adding a reminder for, and nobody in that office yet understood exactly what that particular filing was actually about to ask of them. Dario's office smelled of the same pipe tobacco he'd quit smoking a decade ago, but never quite stopped smelling like. The file cabinets behind his desk older than most of the associates who now worked down the hall from him. Sit, he said, already pulling a thick folder before I'd finished explaining why I'd called. I drafted the credit agreement's personnel section myself, 11 years ago. I remember exactly what's in it. Tell me anyway. I want to hear it out loud. He read it aloud once quickly. Then again slowly, the second pass tracing the paragraph with one finger the whole way through. The lender designated you, by name and by role, as key person for purposes of this facility. Removal or replacement of the key person without the lender's prior written consent constitutes an immediate event of default under Section 9.1g. In plain terms, Eduardo just fired the one person this bank specifically required to stay in that chair as a condition of lending Highland College $120 million. Does the agreement give any grace period before it's formally triggered? The default triggers on the act itself. What varies is how quickly the bank notices and how they choose to enforce it once they do. So nothing happens automatically until someone actually reads the certificate. Correct. Which means, practically, you have until the next compliance filing goes out, unless somebody on the bank side happens to notice sooner, which experienced relationship managers sometimes do. He flipped one page further, tapping a second clause I hadn't asked about yet. There's also a standard courtesy period once the bank does notice, 66 hours is what this lender typically holds before escalating from a phone call to a formal reservation of rights letter. It's not written into the agreement itself. It's simply how this particular relationship manager has always operated, according to 3 other clients I've represented against this same bank. That's a narrow window to actually fix anything. It's narrow by design. Banks don't build generous timelines into informal courtesies. Dario made 2 copies right there on his own machine before I left, one stapled and dated for his file, one folded into an envelope for me to carry out myself. Neither of us called it evidence. It was simply a section of a contract that had said the same thing for 11 straight years, regardless of who currently believed otherwise. Highland's own counsel never flagged this to Eduardo directly. I flagged it to the general counsel's office the week the reorganization was first proposed, Dario said. I got a meeting invite that got rescheduled twice and then quietly dropped. Still got the chain? Every message of it, time-stamped. Draft enough contracts and you learn arguments lose to dated file names every single time. The brass key sat on the desk between us the whole conversation, set down without thinking when I'd emptied my pockets to find my phone, its worn teeth catching the lamplight at an angle I'd seen 1,000 times before. Min called that same week, almost as an aside. The relationship manager emailed finance asking for an updated org chart ahead of next quarter's certificate. Said it's standard pre-filing housekeeping. Wanted names and titles confirmed by Friday. Did she specify why now, this particular quarter? No, just said it's routine. Nobody at Highland College thought to hold that routine request up against what had actually changed on the org chart just days before. Not yet, and not until the paperwork itself eventually made the comparison impossible to avoid. 3 weeks in, Eduardo pulled up a headcount chart in front of the full leadership team and framed the regional consolidation as 6 figures of overhead removed cleanly and ahead of schedule. I heard about it secondhand from Min, who texted me a photo of the slide itself before he'd even left the building. My old title, crossed out in red, the phrase Founders Era Relic typed directly beneath it in the speaker notes visible on his laptop screen. We talked properly that evening, on the phone, Min walking his dog around the block twice while we spoke, the sound of traffic occasionally drowning out a word here and there. He tapped the frame on that magazine cover of his twice during the applause, Min said. Same as always. Applause or silence people were being polite about. Somewhere in between, honestly. A few genuine claps. Mostly people checking their phones. Did he mention who's covering my old responsibilities day to day? He said the regional structure absorbs redundancy organically. Didn't name anyone specific. That's not an answer. It wasn't meant to be one. Has legal responded to your email yet? Got a one-line reply. Appreciate the flag. We'll circle back. Nothing since. Meanwhile, the regional manager brought in to absorb part of my old scope had already stepped into one real problem. He'd routed a temperature-sensitive load through a facility with no functioning cold storage and only caught the mistake 4 hours in, after a driver flagged it himself over the radio. Did that reach Eduardo? I asked. It reached him. He called it a rounding error in an otherwise clean transition. 4 hours of spoiled product isn't rounding. Agreed. He also mentioned nobody had walked the new manager through any lender-facing documentation before handing him the role, because nobody told him it existed. Correct. He genuinely seemed surprised such documentation was even a category of thing. He'll learn the category exists eventually, usually the hard way. That's my read too, though I didn't say it out loud in the meeting. I stayed out of it entirely. No calls, no memos, no requests for a meeting nobody had scheduled. Silence wasn't disengagement here. It was simply the shape available to a man who no longer had any actual standing in that building, and who'd learned, over enough years, which battles were worth spending what little standing remained, and which ones simply resolved themselves on a longer clock than most people had the patience to wait for. Min's tone shifted before he said the next part. The bank's relationship manager reached out again this morning. More specific this time. Wants written confirmation there's been no change in key person status ahead of the certificate. Who's she asking? Me, informally. But the certificate itself gets signed by Eduardo. Then whatever gets confirmed, it needs to come from him, not from you standing in for him. I already told her that much. She didn't love the answer. She's not supposed to love it. She's supposed to notice it. Eduardo's consolidation numbers ran in the internal newsletter days later, framed as evidence the transition had gone smoothly and under budget, with no mention anywhere of an email still sitting, unanswered, in a folder marked pending. That unanswered message, sitting quietly in a folder nobody had bothered reopening, was fast becoming the single, most consequential email nobody at Highland College had yet found 30 honest seconds to type a real reply to. The signed compliance certificate went out from Highland College at 9:02 that Friday morning, Eduardo's own signature on the key person attestation line, and by 11:40 the bank's credit review desk had already flagged a mismatch between that attestation and the organizational filings submitted 2 weeks earlier. By 1:15, the mismatch had moved from an analyst's queue to her supervisor's desk. By 2:30, the credit committee itself had been looped in, a meeting nobody at Highland College had been invited to or even knew was happening. Dario called me at 3:40. They're treating it as a false attestation, Harold. Not just a covenant gap, a signed document that doesn't match reality. Did Eduardo know what he was signing when he signed it? He says he assumed the certificate was routine. Says nobody flagged anything unusual about this quarter's version. Nobody flagged it because he's the one who kept moving the meeting where it would have gotten flagged. I'm aware. I don't think the bank cares whose fault the ignorance is, only that it exists. That's a different category of problem for them. Considerably different. Once something's classified as a false attestation, it routes straight to legal review. Nobody at the bank gets to sit on it or use their own judgment. While all of that moved through a building I no longer had a badge for, I spent the better part of the afternoon replacing a worn belt on the lawn tractor in my garage, hands smelling faintly of two-stroke oil, an old radio on low in the background, waiting on nothing in particular. Min called at 4:50, his voice tighter than I'd heard it in the 2 years I'd known him. The bank's asking for a call with the board directly. Tomorrow morning. Did they say why? They said the words, reservation of rights. Eduardo keeps asking what it means. So far everyone he's asked has found somewhere else to be. Ask finance to run the actual exposure number before that call happens. Not an estimate. The real one. Min got back to me before I'd finished cleaning the tractor blade. 120,960,000 is the total facility exposure. Spread across the 66 hours Dario flagged. Finance is calling it roughly 1.83 million an hour if the bank actually restricts draws. Did finance flag that number to Eduardo directly? They tried. He asked them to double-check it first. Did they? Twice. Same number both times. What's Eduardo's reaction been? Quieter than earlier. He asked whether there was anyone he could call personally to smooth this over. There isn't. Credit committees don't smooth over false attestations because someone sounds sincere on the phone. I told him something close to that. He didn't love hearing it from me specifically. I placed no calls of my own that afternoon, to the board or the bank or anyone still drawing a paycheck from that building. Whatever I confirmed only because someone asked directly, and every fact behind it had been sitting on paper since a Tuesday, 5 weeks back, waiting for anyone to bother reading it. By early evening, the calls out of Highland College thinned to nothing at all. Not long after that, a different set of calls began. This time from a law firm none of us had ever personally spoken to before, listed clearly on the credit agreement's own signature block as the bank's outside counsel of record. The board convened in the same fourth-floor conference room where I'd once sat through a decade of quarterly reviews, walls still hung with the same faded photographs of terminals that had closed years before I ever started here. Dario came with me, the credit agreement's personnel section flagged and tapped. The chairman opened before Eduardo could get past hello. We're here because outside counsel says we're facing a false attestation, and I want to understand exactly how that happened before anyone says another word. With respect, I signed what compliance handed me, Eduardo said. If there's an error, it's an administrative one, not something I did knowingly. I stand by what I told Harold from the start. Legacy overhead doesn't scale, and that principle hasn't changed. Administrative errors don't usually involve firing the one person named on the underlying clause, Dario said. This one does. I drafted that clause myself in this exact agreement, 11 years ago. That clause is over a decade old. Org structures evolve. Clauses don't expire because a structure evolves around them, Dario said. They expire when the parties who negotiated them agree to amend them. Nobody asked the lender's permission before this restructuring touched a key person designation. We were operating in good faith. Good faith isn't a defense to an event of default. It's a defense to intent, and intent isn't actually the issue here. So what exactly is the issue? Eduardo asked. The issue is that a designation existed, in writing, and got removed without anyone checking whether removing it was even permitted. Nobody told me it existed. Someone tried, I said. More than once. The role you eliminated was projected to save this company $144,000 a year. I'd asked the board to sit with that number next to the one Dario just read out, before anyone calls this administrative. He didn't have a response ready for that. So he looked instead at the chairman, as if the chairman might offer one for him. Eduardo's hand drifted toward where the magazine cover would have hung in his own office, an old reflex with nothing to land on in this room, and settled flat against the table instead, fingers not quite steady against the wood grain. What's the board's actual exposure if this isn't resolved? The chairman asked, to Dario rather than to Eduardo. Full acceleration risk on $120,960,000, plus cross-default provisions on 2 smaller facilities that reference this one directly by name. Nobody spoke for several seconds. What would the bank accept as a cure? The chairman asked. Reinstatement of Harold as the named key person, in writing, with the bank's prior consent this time. Confirmation that he retains actual operational authority, not a title without scope. And a corrected certificate, resubmitted, with an accompanying letter explaining the original error plainly. That's a significant walkback of the reorganization. It's the walkback the agreement already requires, Dario said. Nobody's inventing new terms here. We're just finally reading the ones that already existed. And if the board declines, the chairman said, more to himself than to the room, then the bank proceeds with acceleration, and this conversation happens again in front of shareholders instead of just us, Dario said. I'd rather have it here. So would I, the chairman said. The chairman looked at Eduardo, then at the tabbed section still open on the table between them. Draft the reinstatement language tonight, he said. I want it in front of the bank before markets open tomorrow. Nobody in that room needed to raise their voice for any of it to land. A clause 11 years in a drawer had simply woken up and started doing exactly the work it had always been sitting there, quietly to do. 7 months after that board meeting, the Regional Freight Association asked me to sit on a panel about operational continuity risk, held 2 floors up from where the Memphis terminal still runs its overnight shift. No company named directly, just the mechanics of what had happened and what it should teach other operators. The equity stake I'd vested the week before all of this started finally paid its first real dividend that same quarter, $2,080,000, calculated exactly per the formula in the original vesting agreement. Not a dollar negotiated up from what the paperwork already promised. Nobody sat me down to award it or explain it. The formula simply ran its course, the way formulas do once nobody's left standing in the way of them. Eduardo left Highland Haulage entirely within 2 months of the board meeting, not pushed out publicly, just quietly reassigned to an advisory role that dissolved on its own once his contract term ran out. The Frame magazine cover went with him, or at least it wasn't on the credenza the one time I stopped by to collect a few personal items from my old desk. I heard, through people who'd know, that he landed at a smaller logistics startup 2 states over, a real operating role this time, rather than a headline-chasing one. I hope it goes well for him. I've got no particular reason to want otherwise, and no real reason to check either. Min took over as the company's formal liaison to the bank's relationship management team, essentially formalizing a role his own flagged emails had already been performing unofficially for months. He checks in every so often, usually just to confirm the org chart still lines up with what the credit agreement actually says. So far, every quarter, the 2 documents have matched. My son's loan balance cleared that same season, the entire remaining principal wiped out in a single transfer rather than dragged across another decade of monthly payments the way it had been running until then. I told him simply that it was handled and left the specifics of how out of it entirely. He'd never once asked for a running account of the guarantee anyway, only ever thanked me for it in the plain, understated way he thanks people for most things. He asked whether I was going to actually slow down now that it was cleared. I told him probably not, at least not yet. And he said that tracked, and we left it there, the conversation moving on to something else entirely within a minute or two. That brass key still rides in my pocket every day, its teeth softer now than they were a year ago, even though it hasn't actually opened a lock in longer than that. I've thought about retiring it more than once. I haven't. It isn't superstition. It's simply the one object in my possession that has never once needed explaining to anyone who understood what 22 years on a dock floor actually means. Work is quieter now in ways that don't show up in any newsletter. Reorganization proposals touching operational roles get routed through legal before they get routed through HR. Nobody's called institutional knowledge a Founders-era relic since. Not in a meeting I've been in, not in one I've heard about secondhand either. It wasn't retaliation, and it never once needed to be. It was a clause that had simply been waiting, patiently, 11 quiet years, for someone to finally test whether it actually meant what it had always said.